My name is Rachel. I was 17 years old the night my mother told me I wasn't her real child. It didn't happen during some dramatic revelation or a carefully planned conversation. It happened in the middle of an argument that, looking back, wasn't even that important. We were fighting about money, about college applications, fees, and the fact that I wanted to apply somewhere out of state instead of staying close to home, like she expected. She was already angry when it started, tired, frustrated, the kind of anger that builds quietly before it finally spills over. I remember standing in the kitchen, my backpack still on my shoulder, explaining why leaving felt necessary to me. I wasn't yelling, I wasn't disrespectful. I was just asking for space to make my own choices. She didn't hear any of that. She cut me off mid-sentence, her face flushed, her voice sharp enough to make the room feel smaller. "You always think you know better," she snapped. "You've always been like this." I said something back. I don't even remember what anymore. Probably something defensive. Probably something honest. That's when she screamed it. "You're not even my real child." The words didn't echo. They didn't need to. They landed and stayed, heavy and absolute. For a moment, the house went completely quiet. No clatter of dishes, no hum from the refrigerator, just the sound of my own breathing. Suddenly too loud. She didn't look shocked by what she'd said. She didn't cover her mouth or backtrack. If anything, she looked relieved, like something she'd been holding in had finally come out. I didn't cry. I didn't yell back. I just stood there, staring at her, trying to understand whether she actually meant it or whether this was something she would immediately take back. She didn't. Instead, she turned away, muttering something about disrespect and ingratitude, as if the argument had simply continued on its normal course. I walked to my room and closed the door behind me. I sat on my bed for a long time, replaying the sentence in my head, searching for a version of it that hurt less. There wasn't one. That night, she never came to apologize. She didn't knock on my door. She didn't soften it with context or explanation. By morning, she acted as if nothing had happened at all. She made coffee. She asked if I wanted breakfast. She talked about errands and schedules. And just like that, the sentence that rewrote my place in the family was treated like it had never been spoken. But I heard it. I carried it with me to school, to work, to every interaction afterward. I watched the way she spoke to me, the way she corrected me more sharply than before, the way her affection felt conditional in a way I hadn't noticed until it had a name. I started to wonder how long she'd been thinking it, whether it had slipped out accidentally, or whether it had always been there, waiting for the right moment. I never asked her what she meant. Part of me was afraid of the answer. Another part already knew it. Because once someone tells you that you don't truly belong to them, you start noticing all the ways they've been reminding you without words. And from that night on, no matter how normal things looked on the surface, I understood something clearly. Whatever she had meant by real child, I wasn't it. After that night, nothing in our house changed in any obvious way. My mother didn't treat me badly. She didn't yell more. She didn't punish me or bring up what she'd said. If anything, she acted calmer, as if releasing those words had lightened something inside her. To anyone watching from the outside, we looked like a normal family moving on from an argument. But I wasn't the same. Once a sentence like that enters your life, it doesn't disappear just because everyone else pretends it never existed. It settles in quietly, changing how you hear every conversation and how you interpret every silence. I started noticing small differences I had brushed off before. The way my mother was quicker to criticize me than my siblings. The way she spoke about them with pride, but about me with caution. When I succeeded, it was treated as expected. When I struggled, it felt like confirmation of something she'd already believed. She never said the words again, but she didn't have to. They echoed in everything she didn't say. If I asked for help, she sighed first. If I made a mistake, she reminded me how hard she'd tried. If I disagreed with her, she called me ungrateful. I learned quickly that the safest way to exist in that house was to need as little as possible. I stopped asking questions. I stopped pushing back. I stopped sharing plans until they were already decided. I told myself this was maturity, that this was how you keep peace in a family. What it really was adaptation. At school, teachers praised my independence. Friends admired how self-sufficient I was. No one saw that independence had grown out of a quiet understanding that support wasn't guaranteed. At home, I watched how my siblings were allowed to fail without consequence, how their mistakes were framed as learning experiences, while mine felt like evidence. Evidence that I was difficult, that I didn't quite fit. Sometimes I wondered if she even remembered saying it, or if she remembered and simply didn't care enough to address it. Both possibilities hurt in different ways. There were moments when she was kind. She asked about my day. She attended school events. She hugged me when relatives were around. Those moments confused me more than the cold ones, because they made me question my own memory. Maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe she hadn't meant it that way. Maybe I was being dramatic. But every time I started to doubt myself, something would happen to remind me. A comment about how I was different, a joke about how stubborn I was compared to her real temperament, a moment where she sided with my siblings without even listening to me. Nothing big, nothing undeniable, just enough to keep the wound open. As the years passed, I stopped looking for reassurance. I stopped hoping she'd correct herself or explain what she meant. I learned to live with the knowledge that my place in the family came with an asterisk. Loved, maybe. Accepted, sometimes, but never fully claimed. That realization changed how I thought about my future. I stopped planning my life around her expectations. I focused on getting out. College, work, independence. Not out of anger, but out of necessity. I knew that if I stayed, I would always be trying to earn something I should have been given freely. Belonging? By the time I left for college, the distance between us felt natural, necessary. Even, we spoke less, and when we did, the conversation stayed shallow. She asked about grades and schedules, not about how I felt. And I learned not to offer more than she asked for. Because growing up knowing you don't fully belong teaches you something very specific. You stop waiting to be chosen. Leaving home didn't feel dramatic. There was no final argument, no slammed doors, no tearful goodbye where everything was suddenly said out loud. I packed my things quietly, loaded them into my car, and drove away, knowing that what I was really leaving behind wasn't a house, but a version of myself that had spent years waiting to be claimed. College gave me distance, and with that distance came clarity. For the first time, I could make decisions without running them through my mother's voice in my head. I chose classes because they interested me, not because they sounded practical enough to justify my existence. I worked part-time, paid my own bills, and learned how to live without checking in for permission. My mother and I stayed in touch, but the relationship changed shape. Our calls became shorter, more functional. She asked about grades, deadlines, whether I was being responsible. She rarely asked how I was actually feeling, and I stopped volunteering that information anyway. It felt easier that way. Whenever I visited home, I noticed how carefully I edited myself. I didn't argue. I didn't challenge her opinions. I played the role she seemed most comfortable with. The distant but polite daughter who didn't ask for much and didn't expect anything in return. She never brought up the argument from years ago. Neither did I. At first, I thought that was maturity. Later, I understood it was avoidance on both sides. Bringing it up would have required her to acknowledge what she'd said. and acknowledging it would have meant taking responsibility for the damage it caused. She preferred normal, and I preferred peace. After graduation, I found a job in another city and moved again, this time without even asking what she thought. I built routines that belonged entirely to me. I made friends who knew me without qualifiers, people who didn't treat my independence like a flaw, or my boundaries like rejection. Slowly, without announcing it to anyone, I built a life where her approval was no longer the measure of my worth. That didn't mean I stopped caring. There were moments, birthdays, holidays, random quiet nights, when I wondered what it would have been like to have a mother who claimed me without hesitation. I felt that absence sharply, like a missing limb you only notice when you reach for something that isn't there. But I learned how to live with it. I learned that love doesn't always come from where it's supposed to. Sometimes it comes from friends who show up, mentors who believe in you, and the version of yourself that learns to stop begging for acceptance. My mother remained in my life, but at a distance that felt safer. We spoke on birthdays and major holidays. She knew the outlines of my life, not the details, and I was careful to keep it that way. Because I had learned something important. Being her daughter didn't require me to keep reopening a wound she refused to acknowledge. And so I didn't. I moved forward. I grew. I built something stable and real without waiting for her to change. I truly believed that chapter was closed. I didn't know yet that years later, when she needed something from me that no one else could give, she would suddenly remember exactly how connected we were supposed to be. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon, right in the middle of my workday. I almost didn't answer. The number wasn't saved, but I recognized it immediately. It was my mother's. For a second, I just stared at the screen, surprised more than anything else. We hadn't spoken in months. When we did talk, it was usually brief and predictable. Holidays, birthdays, the occasional update delivered without emotion. This felt different. I stepped out of my office, found a quiet corner near the stairwell, and answered. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. Softer, careful in a way that immediately put me on edge. "Claire," she said, like she wasn't sure I'd pick up. I didn't know who else to call. That sentence alone told me something was wrong. She didn't launch into explanations right away. She asked how I was. She said she hoped I was doing well. The words felt rehearsed, like she was easing into something she'd practiced saying out loud. Then she told me she had been sick for a while. Kidney disease. It had progressed faster than expected. Treatments were no longer enough. Her doctor had started talking seriously about a transplant. I listened without interrupting, leaning against the wall, feeling that strange disconnect that happens when someone from your past suddenly demands your full attention again. She said the word family more than once. She talked about testing, about compatibility, about how siblings had already been checked. She explained that the best chance came from close relatives. Then she paused. "You're a match," she said quietly. "Or at least, you might be. The doctor thinks you have a good chance." The hallway felt suddenly too narrow. I didn't respond right away. Not because I didn't understand, but because I understood too well. Out of all the things she could have called me for, this was the one that brought everything rushing back. The argument, the sentence, the years of silence built on pretending it never happened. She kept talking, filling the space I left empty. She said she knew we hadn't always been close. She said she regretted things she'd said in the past. She said she was scared. "I wouldn't ask if I didn't have to," she added, her voice breaking just slightly. "But you're my daughter." That word landed harder than anything else she'd said. My daughter. The same word she had stripped from me years ago in the middle of a kitchen argument and never returned. I closed my eyes, gripping my phone a little tighter. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I told her I needed time. She accepted that answer quickly. Too quickly. like she already knew she didn't have the right to ask for more. Before hanging up, she said she hoped we could talk soon, not just about the transplant, but about everything. When the call ended, I stayed there longer than necessary, listening to the distant hum of the building around me, trying to slow my breathing. It was strange how life worked like that. Years of distance hadn't required conversation. Years of silence hadn't required repair. But the moment her life depended on my body, suddenly there was urgency. Suddenly, there were regrets. Suddenly, I was family again. I walked back to my desk and finished my workday on autopilot. Numbers blurred together. Emails went unanswered. All I could think about was the question she hadn't asked directly but had placed squarely in my hands. If I wasn't her real child when it mattered to her pride, what did that make me now that she needed a kidney? That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, replaying her voice over and over. Not the fear in it, but the familiarity, the way she'd said my daughter like it had never been taken away. I realized then that this wasn't just about a medical decision. It was about whether a sentence spoken years ago still had the power to decide what I owed her now. The pressure didn't come all at once. It never does. It started with small messages that felt harmless on the surface. A text from my aunt asking how I was doing. A voicemail from a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years, saying they'd heard about my mom's health and wanted to check in. Each message was gentle, careful, wrapped in concern. But underneath all of them was the same unspoken expectation. I was supposed to say yes. My mother called again a few days later. She sounded more fragile this time, like the fear had settled in and decided to stay. She told me about doctor appointments, about dialysis, about how exhausting everything felt. She didn't push directly. She didn't have to. Instead, she talked about memories. She mentioned the house I grew up in, the holidays we used to spend together. She laughed softly about things I barely remembered, painting a picture of closeness that felt incomplete, like a story told with important parts missing. I know I wasn't perfect, she said carefully. I said things I shouldn't have, but I was angry. I didn't mean them. I stayed quiet, listening. I was just trying to scare you, she added, as if that explained everything. Scare you? I wondered how many years a sentence like that was allowed to last if it was spoken in anger. Then the calls from relatives became more direct. She's still your mother, my aunt said during one conversation. People say things they don't mean when they're upset. Another relative reminded me that kidney donation was common now, that people lived perfectly normal lives afterward. They spoke about statistics and recovery times, careful to frame it as reassurance instead of persuasion. No one asked how I felt about it. They talked as if my body was already part of the solution, just waiting for my consent to catch up. The phrase family is family came up more times than I could count. It was used like a rule, something solid and unquestionable, as if biology alone erased history, as if blood could overwrite words. Every time I heard it, I thought back to that night in the kitchen, to how easily she had removed me from that definition when she was angry, how little it had taken for me to stop being her real child. Now, suddenly, the rules had changed. Now, family meant obligation. My mother cried during one call, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to make her voice shake. She said she was scared of dying. She said she didn't want things to end this way, with so much left unresolved. I just want a chance to fix things, she said. This could be that chance. That was when I realized what was really being asked of me. This wasn't just about saving her life. It was about redeeming hers. She wanted my kidney to stand in for an apology she'd never fully given. She wanted my sacrifice to erase years of silence and avoidance. She wanted the story to end with forgiveness that required nothing from her, except survival. And everyone around us seemed to agree. They spoke about gratitude, about regret, about how I would feel afterward if I said no. They warned me, gently, about guilt I might carry for the rest of my life. No one warned me about the cost of saying yes. At night, I lay awake replaying conversations from years ago. Not just the argument, but everything that followed. The way she'd pretended it never happened. The way I'd learned to live with that distance. I thought about how long it had taken me to build a life where her approval no longer defined me. Now, that balance was being tested. I wasn't angry. I was exhausted. Exhausted by the assumption that forgiveness had to be physical, that love had to come at the cost of my own body, that the child who had been told she didn't belong was now expected to prove her loyalty in the most irreversible way possible. Family is family, they said. But the truth was, family had already been used once to push me away, and I wasn't sure I was willing to let it be used again to pull something out of me I could never get back. I agreed to get tested. Not because I had made up my mind, and not because I felt obligated, but because I needed to know the truth before anyone else could decide it for me. I told myself information wasn't a commitment, it was just a step. Something neutral. The hospital felt cold in that familiar, impersonal way. White walls, clipped voices, forms handed across counters without eye contact. The nurse explained the process carefully, as if I hadn't already heard it from a dozen well-meaning relatives. Blood tests, imaging, evaluations. Risks they were legally required to mention but socially expected to minimize. I nodded through all of it. While they drew my blood, I stared at the ceiling and thought about how strange it was that my body had suddenly become a topic of group discussion. People who hadn't asked about my life in years now had opinions about my organs, my recovery time, my responsibility. No one asked if I was afraid. The results came back quicker than I expected. I was a match. Not a borderline one. Not a maybe. A good, clean match. The kind doctors sound relieved to talk about. The kind families celebrate before the person attached to the organ has said a word. When I told my mother, she cried. This time it wasn't restrained. Her relief poured out of her in uneven breaths and broken sentences. She thanked me before I had agreed to anything. She talked about second chances and new beginnings, about how this would bring us closer than ever. I let her talk. I let everyone talk. Relatives called to tell me how proud they were of me, as if the decision had already been made. They praised my strength, my generosity, my heart. They spoke about me in the future tense, assuming a version of me that had already given something up. What no one wanted to hear was hesitation. When I tried to voice it, even gently, the room seemed to tighten. People reassured me too quickly, answered questions I hadn't asked, dismissed concerns I hadn't finished expressing. You'll be fine, they said. People live normal lives with one kidney. She's your mom, as if biology was the final argument. Late one night, after another conversation that left me feeling small and cornered, I sat alone at my kitchen table and finally asked myself the question I'd been avoiding. If she wasn't my real child when it came to love, when it came to pride, when it came to belonging, why was my body suddenly real enough to save her life? That question didn't feel cruel, it felt honest. I realized then that forgiveness and sacrifice had been blurred together by everyone around me, as if they were the same thing. As if saying, "I forgive you," automatically meant I will give you whatever you need. But they weren't the same. Forgiveness lived in my chest. This decision lived in my body. One could be given quietly. The other would change me forever. I thought about recovery, about pain, about potential complications no one wanted to dwell on. I thought about how long it had taken me to feel ownership over my own life, how carefully I'd built boundaries that kept me whole. And I thought about how easily those boundaries were being treated as selfishness now. My mother called again the next morning. Her voice was hopeful in a way that made my stomach tighten. She talked about scheduling, about timelines, about how the doctor said we could move quickly if everyone agreed. I listened, then interrupted her gently. I need you to understand something, I said. Getting tested didn't mean I promised anything. There was a pause on the line. She said she understood, but her voice told me she didn't. That was when I knew the decision I was being asked to make wasn't really about medicine. It was about whether I would once again silence myself to make someone else comfortable. Whether I would allow guilt to rewrite a boundary I had fought years to build. I wasn't deciding whether she deserved to live. I was deciding whether I was allowed to protect myself. And for the first time since that night in the kitchen, I realized something with absolute clarity. Whatever I chose, I was going to disappoint someone. The question was whether I was finally willing to let that someone be her instead of me. I told my mother no on a quiet Sunday morning. There was no dramatic build-up, no speech I'd rehearsed in advance. I simply said it plainly, the way you say something when you've already accepted what it will cost you. I'm not going to donate my kidney, I said. I'm sorry. The silence on the other end of the line stretched longer than I expected. I could hear her breathing, uneven and sharp, like she was trying to steady herself. But you're a match, she finally said. The doctor said, I know, I replied. That doesn't change my answer. She asked me why, even though I knew she already had an answer she preferred. I didn't talk about statistics or long-term risks. I didn't list reasons she could argue with. I told her the truth. Because my body isn't something I can give away to fix something you never took responsibility for. She cried then. Not softly. Not carefully. She cried the way people do when they feel a door closing that they assumed would always open for them. She said she had made mistakes. She said she was angry back then. She said she didn't mean it. She said she was scared. I believed her, but believing her didn't undo the years I'd spent learning how to live with what she'd said. I can forgive you, I told her, but I can't do this. Forgiveness, I had learned, doesn't require proof in flesh. The fallout came quickly. Relatives called. Their voices tight with disappointment they tried to disguise as concern. Some told me I'd regret this decision. Others said I'd have to live with it if something happened to her. A few stopped calling altogether, their silence loud with judgment. My mother stopped speaking to me entirely. At first, that hurt more than I expected. Even after everything. A part of me had hoped she would still try to understand, still want me in her life outside of what I could give her. But as weeks passed, the absence started to feel familiar. It felt like the old distance returning, the one that had existed long before illness ever entered the picture. And that's when I realized something important. Her love had always come with conditions. I had just finally refused to meet them. I didn't celebrate my decision. I didn't feel triumphant or relieved in any dramatic way. What I felt was quiet and steady, like standing on solid ground after years of trying to balance on something unstable. I went back to my routines, work, friends, evenings that belonged to me. Slowly, the noise faded. I don't know how my mother's story ends. I know she was placed on a waiting list. I know other options were explored. I know people stepped in where I didn't. What I do know is this. The night she told me I wasn't her real child, she took something from me she never gave back. Years later, when she needed a part of my body to survive, she asked me to pretend that sentence had never mattered, but it did, and it always would. I forgave her, quietly, without ceremony, not for her sake, but for mine. I let go of the anger, the resentment, the need for acknowledgement I was never going to get. What I didn't give up was myself. She said I wasn't her real child. I believed her, and for the first time in my life, I acted like it, by protecting the life that was actually mine.